1945. Japanese comfort women couldn't believe what Black American soldiers did next to them. I watched as the women were led off the train, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. My own heart raced, despite trying to maintain a calm exterior. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the tracks seemed to echo the pounding in my chest. Among them, Yuki's usually composed face showed signs of strain, and Keiko's jaw was set tight with tension. The bitter Wisconsin winter wind whipped around us as we descended onto the platform. I had never felt cold quite like this before. It seemed to cut right through the thin fabric of our clothes. Our small group huddled closer together instinctively, seeking whatever warmth we could find in each other's presence. When I first saw the American soldiers waiting for us, my breath caught in my throat, but these weren't the monsters we'd been warned about in Japan. Most of them were black men, their dark faces surprisingly gentle, as they gestured for us to follow them. I noticed how some of them kept a respectful distance, while others moved forward with careful steps, as if approaching wounded animals. "This way, please," one soldier said in broken Japanese, his voice softer than I expected. It was strange to hear our language from an American mouth, even if the pronunciation wasn't quite right. We were led to a barrack that, while basic, was clean and dry. There were simple cots with blankets, actual blankets, and even a small potbelly stove in the center of the room. It was more than any of us had dared to hope for. "I don't trust this," Keiko whispered to me in Japanese as we settled onto our assigned cots. "It must be some kind of trick." Her eyes darted suspiciously toward the door where a soldier stood guard. But I wasn't so sure. I watched as another soldier, a tall man who seemed to be in charge, directed others to bring us bowls of hot soup and bread. Real bread, not the moldy scraps we'd grown accustomed to. The steam rising from the soup bowls carried a savory smell that made my stomach growl embarrassingly loud. "Eat," the tall soldier said, introducing himself as Sergeant Brown. His kind eyes crinkled at the corners when he spoke. "Please, eat while it's hot." Yuki, who had been silent since our arrival, stared at her bowl with uncertainty. I could see the internal struggle playing across her face, the hunger warring with suspicion, hope fighting against fear. I took a small sip of my soup first, trying to show the others it was safe. The warm broth felt like heaven against my throat, and I couldn't help but close my eyes briefly in appreciation. When I opened them again, I noticed Sergeant Brown watching us with what looked like genuine concern. Throughout that first day, the soldiers brought us more food, extra blankets, and even some basic toiletries. They spoke quietly, moved slowly, and always maintained a respectful distance. It was so different from what we'd expected that it left us all confused and off balance. As evening approached, I watched Yuki sitting on the edge of her cot, her thin fingers gripping the blanket tightly. Sergeant Brown passed by the barrack entrance, offering her a warm smile. The look on her face, a mixture of uncertainty, fear, and something that might have been hope, reflected what we were all feeling. Could we trust this kindness? Or were we fools to let our guard down, even for a moment? I pulled my own blanket tighter around my shoulders, trying to sort through my conflicting emotions. The warmth of the stove, the fullness in my stomach, and the absence of immediate threat made it hard to maintain the wall of fear we'd built around ourselves. Yet years of trauma had taught us that safety could be an illusion, and kindness could hide darker intentions. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. I watch from my thin mattress as morning light filters through the barrack's small windows. None of us slept well. How could we? Every creak and footstep outside made us flinch. Even now, Keiko sits rigidly on her cot, dark circles under her eyes, while Yuki keeps fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. The sounds of the camp drift in, boots crunching on gravel, men calling out to each other in English, the clang of metal pots from somewhere nearby. My stomach growls, reminding me that we barely touched last night's meal. We were too scared to eat much, even though the food smelled better than anything we'd had in months. "Breakfast time," announces a soldier at the door. His voice is gentle, nothing like the harsh barks we expected. Still, we hesitate until Yuki slowly stands, smoothing her wrinkled dress. I follow her lead, with Keiko trailing behind. Outside, the morning air is crisp and clean. Other women from our barracks join us, forming a quiet line as we shuffle toward the mess hall. I notice how the American soldiers, all of them black men, keep a respectful distance. They don't leer or shout like the Japanese soldiers did. They don't grab at us or make demands. Inside the mess hall, the warmth and smell of food makes my mouth water. Sergeant Brown stands near the serving line, his presence both commanding and oddly comforting. "Please," he says in broken Japanese, gesturing to the food. "Eat well. You are safe here. Geneva Convention protects you." I watch Yuki's face as she accepts a bowl of hot rice and eggs. Her eyes widen slightly. She didn't expect such abundance. None of us did. The soldier serving food smiles at each woman, patient and kind. No sneers, no rough handling, no cruel jokes. We sit together at a corner table, our shoulders touching for comfort. Across the room, I see American soldiers eating their own breakfast, talking and laughing among themselves. They don't stare at us, or make us feel like animals in a cage. "It must be a trick," Keiko whispers, though she can't help taking another spoonful of food. "They're trying to fool us." But as I watch Private Jackson, I learned his name from his uniform. Help old Mrs. Tanizaki with her heavy tray. I'm not so sure. Mrs. Tanizaki's hands shake too much to carry it herself, and the young soldier guides her to a seat with such care, such genuine concern in his eyes. Yuki notices too. I see something flicker across her face. A moment of softening before she catches herself and looks down at her bowl. We were taught that Americans were devils, barbaric monsters who would torture us if given the chance. But these men... "The food is good," I whisper, daring to voice what we're all thinking. Keiko shoots me a warning look, but Yuki nods slightly. I know we're all comparing this meal to the propaganda we were fed about American brutality, about how they would starve and abuse us if we were captured. I finish my breakfast slowly, savoring each bite. My mind keeps returning to Private Jackson's gentle handling of Mrs. Tanizaki, to Sergeant Brown's quiet dignity, to all the small kindnesses we've witnessed since arriving. It doesn't feel like pity. It feels like something else entirely, something I'm almost afraid to name. I watch from my cot as Yuki tries to hide her shivering. She's been getting worse over the past few days, but she won't admit it. That's just like her, always trying to be strong for everyone else. The wooden walls of our barracks do little to keep out the Wisconsin winter chill, and I can see her pulling her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Yuki-san," I whisper in the darkness. "Are you okay?" She doesn't answer, but I can hear her teeth chattering. The other women are asleep, their soft breathing filling our cramped quarters. Even Keiko's usual restless muttering is quiet tonight. Morning comes too slowly. When the wake-up bell rings, Yuki can barely lift her head. Her face is as white as the snow outside, except for two bright spots of color on her cheeks. My heart aches seeing her like this. During breakfast roll call, I stand close to her, trying to help her stay upright. Sergeant Brown notices right away. Nothing seems to escape his kind eyes. He walks over to us, his boots crunching in the frozen grass. "Miss Takahashi?" His voice is gentle, like he's talking to a frightened bird. "Are you unwell?" Yuki tries to bow and nearly falls over. Sergeant Brown catches her arm, steadying her. The touch makes her flinch, but she's too weak to pull away. "Please," I say in my broken English. "She is very sick." Without hesitation, Sergeant Brown calls over two other soldiers. They help Yuki to the infirmary, supporting her between them. I want to follow, but I have kitchen duty. All morning, as I peel potatoes, I worry about her. Later, I sneak away to check on her. The infirmary is just a converted storage building, but it's warmer than our barracks. Through the window, I see Sergeant Brown sitting beside Yuki's bed. He's holding a bowl of soup, waiting patiently as she takes small sips. My throat tightens at the sight. It reminds me of my father, how he used to care for me when I was sick, before everything changed. Sergeant Brown's dark face is creased with genuine concern as he speaks softly to Yuki. She looks confused, almost afraid of his kindness. I understand her fear. We were taught that Americans were devils, especially the black soldiers. But watching Sergeant Brown tend to Yuki with such gentleness makes my eyes fill with tears. This man, who should hate us, shows more compassion than many of our own countrymen did. Every day, he visits her. I see him bringing warm broth, checking her temperature, making sure she has enough blankets. The nurse tells me Yuki has a bad fever, but she's getting better thanks to their care. One afternoon, I bring her some tea and find her awake, staring at the ceiling. Her face is troubled, like she's trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "The Americans," she whispers when she sees me. "Why are they so kind to us? After everything?" I sit on the edge of her bed. "Maybe," I say carefully. "They know what it's like to be treated badly because of who they are. Maybe that's why they choose to be different." Yuki doesn't respond, but I can see the conflict in her eyes. The same conflict I feel every time Sergeant Brown or the other soldiers show us unexpected kindness. It's harder to hold on to hate when faced with such genuine compassion. From where I stand near the window of our barrack, I can see Keiko's stern face as she approaches Yuki's bed. The morning light streams through the dusty glass, catching the worry lines etched deep in Keiko's forehead. My heart tightens as I watch her lean close to Yuki, who's still pale from her recent fever. "We cannot trust them," Keiko whispers, but her voice carries clearly to where I'm standing. "No matter how they act now, they are still our enemies." I fidget with the edge of my sleeve, wanting to speak up but knowing my place as the youngest. Yuki's eyes meet mine briefly before returning to Keiko's intense gaze. The tension in the room feels thick enough to cut with a knife. "During the war," Keiko continues, her voice dropping even lower, "I heard stories of what American soldiers did to our people. The brutality, the violence, this kindness, it must be a trick." I can't help but shake my head slightly. The American soldiers I've seen here, especially Sergeant Brown, have shown nothing but gentleness. Just yesterday, I watched him help old Mrs. Tanizaki with her laundry when she was struggling with the heavy, wet clothes. "Emiko," Keiko snaps, noticing my reaction. "You're too young to understand. Your innocence will get you killed." But I do understand, perhaps more than Keiko knows. I understand pain and suffering, just as we all do. But I also understand that kindness can be real, even from unexpected sources. I've seen it in small gestures, the extra portion of rice Private Thompson sneaks onto our plates, the way Sergeant Brown always knocks before entering our barracks, giving us time to feel prepared. Yuki remains silent through Keiko's warnings, her fingers absently smoothing the rough blanket on her cot. I can see the conflict in her eyes, the same conflict I feel. We were taught to hate these men, to fear them. But how can we maintain that hatred when faced with such persistent kindness? "Look at what they did to our cities," Keiko insists, her voice trembling slightly. "The bombs, the destruction. How can we forget that?" I step closer, finally finding my voice. "But these soldiers, they're different. They're not the ones who—" "Silence!" Keiko cuts me off sharply, but I notice something in her eyes. Not anger, but fear. Deep, consuming fear. Through the window, I spot Sergeant Brown helping another prisoner, an elderly man who's having trouble walking. The sergeant's patience is evident in every careful step he takes, matching the old man's slow pace. His kindness seems so natural, so unforced. Yuki watches too, her expression thoughtful. I can see the doubt in her eyes. Not doubt about the American's kindness, but doubt about Keiko's warnings. The silence between us grows heavy with unspoken thoughts. I want to tell them both what I truly believe, that perhaps in this strange place, far from home, we found something unexpected. Not just safety, but a chance to see beyond the hatred we were taught. But I hold my tongue, knowing that some truths must be discovered personally, not told. Keiko straightens her back, her jaw set firmly. "Just remember what I said," she warns one final time before walking away, her footsteps echoing in the quiet barrack. I watch as Yuki's gaze returns to the window, following Sergeant Brown's gentle guidance of the elderly prisoner. In her eyes, I see the first glimmer of something new, something that looks remarkably like hope. I watched carefully as Yuki, Keiko, and I were led into the camp kitchen. The morning sun streamed through the small windows, casting long shadows across the metal countertops. My heart was pounding, but I tried to keep my expression neutral as one of the black soldiers handed us each a clean white apron. "You'll be helping with meal preparation," he explained in slow, clear English. His voice was gentle, nothing like the harsh tones we'd been warned about. I glanced at Keiko, who stood rigid and alert, her fingers clutching the apron like it might be yanked away at any moment. The kitchen was warm and surprisingly clean. Steam rose from large pots on the industrial stoves, and the smell of cooking rice filled the air. It reminded me of home, before everything changed. Another soldier demonstrated how to properly hold the knife for chopping vegetables, his movements careful and patient. I couldn't help but notice how he kept a respectful distance, never touching us or raising his voice. "Like this?" Yuki asked, softly, mimicking his cutting technique. The soldier nodded, offering an encouraging smile. I saw something shift in Yuki's expression, a tiny crack in her armor of fear. As we worked, more soldiers came and went, each one treating us with the same unexpected courtesy. They showed us where to find clean dishes, how to operate the large soup kettles, and which vegetables needed preparing first. My hands fell into a rhythm, the familiar motions of cooking bringing an almost surreal sense of normalcy. Keiko remained at the far end of the kitchen, scrubbing pots with such intensity that her knuckles turned white. I wanted to tell her to relax, that maybe things weren't as terrible as we'd imagined, but I knew better than to challenge her fears so soon. Sergeant Brown made regular appearances throughout the morning. Each time he entered, I noticed how Yuki's movements would slow slightly, her attention drawn to his presence like a compass needle to north. He never stayed long, but his visits always included a kind word or a question about our comfort. "Are the knives sharp enough?" he asked once. "Do you need more onions?" Another time. Such simple questions, but they carried a weight of humanity we hadn't expected. I found myself stealing glances at him when he wasn't looking, trying to reconcile this man with the monsters we'd been warned about. His uniform was always crisp, his manner professional but warm. When he spoke to us, he looked us in the eyes, something that spoke of respect rather than intimidation. As the morning wore on, I settled into a comfortable routine at the vegetable preparation station. The steady chop-chop-chop of my knife against the cutting board became almost meditative. Nearby, Yuki worked quietly, her movements becoming more confident with each passing hour. When lunchtime approached, most of the soldiers left to manage the serving line. I watched as Yuki remained behind to clean the prep tables. Sergeant Brown entered the kitchen. Once more, his boots making soft sounds against the floor. They exchanged words I couldn't quite hear, but I saw how Yuki's hands stilled on the cloth she was using. The sergeant's smile was gentle, concerned even, as he asked her something that made her pause. I pretended to be absorbed in my own tasks, but I couldn't help wondering if Yuki was experiencing the same confusion I felt. This disconnect between what we'd been taught to expect and the reality we were experiencing. I sat on my thin mattress, my legs crossed beneath me, watching the shadows dance on the barrack walls. The day's work in the kitchen had left my hands smelling of onions and soap, but I didn't mind. It felt good to be useful again, to have a purpose beyond just existing. Keiko's voice broke through the evening quiet. "My mother used to make the best miso soup," she said, her words floating in the dim light. "Every morning before dawn, I would wake to the smell of it simmering." Her usually stern face softened as she spoke of home. I leaned forward, eager to hear more. It was rare for Keiko to share anything personal. "What else do you remember about your family?" I asked gently. She sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry all her doubts. "My father was a shopkeeper in Osaka. He believed in honor, in doing things the right way." Her voice turned bitter. "Look where honor got us. These Americans? They act kind now, but how can we trust them?" "But they've been nothing but good to us," I said, unable to keep quiet. "Sergeant Brown, especially. Did you see how he helped Mrs. Tanaka with her dishes today?" "You're too young to understand, Emiko," Keiko snapped, but there was more weariness than anger in her tone. Good intentions can hide darker motives. From her cot, Yuki stirred. She'd been so quiet, I'd almost forgotten she was there. Her face was turned toward the window, where moonlight spilled through the crude curtains. "I keep thinking about before," Yuki whispered, and we all knew what she meant. The comfort stations, the endless parade of soldiers, the shame that still haunts us all. I never thought I'd feel safe again. But here. She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. I hugged my knees to my chest, feeling the familiar ache in my heart. "Maybe this is our chance," I ventured. "To learn something new, to understand our enemies better. The war can't last forever." "Learn?" Keiko scoffed. "What could we possibly learn from them?" "Kindness," I said simply. "They show us kindness when they don't have to." The word hung in the air between us. Outside, crickets chirped, and somewhere in the distance, a guard's boots crunched on gravel. The familiar sounds of the camp had become almost comforting. Yuki shifted on her cot. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "I think about what comes after. After the war, after this camp. Will we ever be more than survivors?" Her question struck deep. I'd been wondering the same thing myself, though I hadn't dared voice it. The future seemed both terrifying and full of possibility. "We survive," Keiko said firmly. "That's all we can do." But even as she said it, I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. We fell into silence then, each lost in our own thoughts. Yuki closed her eyes, her face troubled even in rest. The camp sounds drifted through the walls, quiet conversations, distant laughter, the rustle of wind in the trees. It was almost peaceful. But we all knew that peace was a fragile thing, especially for women like us. My gaze drifted to the window, where stars peppered the Wisconsin sky. They were the same stars that shone over Japan, I thought. The same stars that had witnessed our suffering and now watched over our tentative steps toward something. Not healing, not yet, but maybe a beginning. I watch anxiously as Nurse Bennett hurries past our barrack, her white apron fluttering in the morning breeze. Something's wrong. More nurses follow, carrying supplies toward the far end of the camp. The whispers start immediately. Fever has broken out among the prisoners. My heart pounds as I remember the epidemics that swept through our villages back home. But this time feels different. Instead of hiding the sick away, the American soldiers are rushing to help. They need assistance in the medical ward. Private Jackson announces at our door. "Any volunteers?" Before I can stop myself, I raise my hand. Yuki follows suit, though Keiko stays back, arms crossed. I understand her hesitation. "Yuki, follow. We've all seen too much suffering already." The medical ward is a long tent filled with cots. The air is thick with the smell of antiseptic. Sergeant Brown stands at the entrance, directing traffic as more sick prisoners arrive. His calm presence settles my nerves somewhat. "Tanaka-san," he says, nodding to me. "We need help changing bandages and cooling fevers. Can you handle that?" "Yes, sir," I reply, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounds. The work is hard but meaningful. I move from cot to cot, placing cool cloths on burning foreheads, helping patients sip water. The American soldiers work alongside us without hesitation. There's no division now between captors and prisoners, just people helping people. Yuki works quietly beside me, her movements precise and gentle. I catch her watching Sergeant Brown as he lifts an elderly man to help him drink. The sergeant's dark hands support the frail Japanese prisoner with such care, such humanity. I never expected this. Yuki whispers to me in Japanese. "They treat us like people." I nod, remembering the propaganda we were fed about American soldiers. They're nothing like what we were told. Throughout the day, Sergeant Brown checks on us regularly, making sure we take breaks and stay hydrated. He speaks to each patient with respect, regardless of their nationality. When a young German prisoner starts shouting deliriously in his fever, Brown calms him with soft words and a steady hand on his shoulder. "My mama was a healer back home," he tells me as we fold clean bandages. "She taught me that suffering doesn't care what uniform you wear or what language you speak. Pain is pain. And kindness is the best medicine we got." His words stick with me as the hours pass. More soldiers and prisoners come to help, forming an unlikely team. Even Keiko appears in the afternoon, silently taking up a position, changing bed sheets. The work continues as the sun begins to set, casting long shadows through the tent. I'm carrying fresh supplies when I notice Yuki standing still, watching Sergeant Brown. He stationed himself at the end of the ward, a quiet guardian keeping watch over the sick. The evening light catches his face, and I see something there, not just duty or obligation, but genuine concern for every soul under his care. Yuki's expression is different too. The hard shell of distrust she's worn since arriving seems to be cracking. In this moment, watching Brown's dedication, something is shifting in her. In all of us. From where I stand folding clean linens, I can see Yuki sitting alone with Sergeant Brown in the quiet corner of the infirmary. The day has been long, filled with tending to the sick and changing sweat-soaked bedding. Most of the patients are finally sleeping, their fevered murmurs creating a soft backdrop to the evening. I pretend to be busy with my task, but I can't help watching their interaction. Something about seeing them together makes my heart ache with both hope and sadness. Through the dim lamplight, I notice how Sergeant Brown's usually straight posture softens as he speaks to Yuki. Back home, I hear him say quietly, "They make us use different water fountains, different bathrooms. Can't even sit at the same lunch counter as white folks." His voice carries a weight I've never heard before. My own father was beaten for looking a white man in the eye, Yuki's hands tighten in her lap. Even from where I stand, I can see the braid, tension in her shoulders. She rarely speaks of her past, but tonight seems different. I understand pain, she whispers, her voice barely audible. When they took us, the soldiers. She pauses, and I feel my own eyes fill with tears, knowing what she's about to share. We were not people to them, just things to be used. My hands shake as I fold another sheet, remembering our shared nightmare. The silence between them feels heavy with understanding. Some nights, Sergeant Brown continues, I wonder if things will ever change, if people will ever see past the color of my skin. He adjusts the blanket of a sleeping patient nearby. But then I think about my mama. She always said that hatred is a heavy burden to carry. That's why I chose to treat you all with kindness when you arrived. I know what it's like to be seen as less than human. Through my own tears, I watch Yuki reach out hesitantly and touch his sleeve. The first day, when you gave us warm food and clean clothes, I thought it was a trick, she admits. I couldn't understand why an American soldier, especially. She stops, embarrassed. Especially a black one? Sergeant Brown's smile holds no bitterness, only understanding. Yes, Yuki whispers. Every bear. Our officers told us terrible things about Americans, especially black soldiers. But you. She looks down at her hands. You showed us what humanity really means. I watch as Sergeant Brown's eyes soften with emotion. We're all carrying scars, Miss Yuki. Some you can see, some you can't. But that doesn't mean we have to let them define us. Yuki nods slowly, wiping a tear from her cheek. Thank you, she says softly, for showing us that kindness can exist even in war. You're stronger than you realize, Miss Yuki. Sergeant Brown replies gently, offering her a warm smile. Both of you are. He glances in my direction, and I realize he's known I was listening all along. I quickly look down at my hands, still clutching the half-folded sheet, my heart full of a strange mixture of sorrow and hope. In this quiet moment, I understand that healing can come from the most unexpected places, even in the midst of war. I watch as Yuki moves through the kitchen with purpose, her movements more confident than I've seen since we arrived at Camp McCoy. The morning sun streams through the small windows, casting warm patches of light on the wooden floor. My hands are busy peeling potatoes, but my mind keeps wandering to how much has changed in these past weeks. Yuki, I call out softly, could you pass me another potato? She hands it to me with a small smile, something that would have been unthinkable just days ago. There's a lightness in her step today, and I wonder if it has something to do with her conversation with Sergeant Brown yesterday. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I heard snippets of their talk in the infirmary. It made my heart ache to hear them share their pain, but somehow it also gave me hope. Keiko works silently beside us, chopping vegetables with precise movements. But even she seems different today. The rigid set of her shoulders has softened slightly, and twice now I've caught her humming under her breath. Something I've never heard before. The officers will be here soon, Keiko says, breaking the silence. Her voice lacks its usual edge of suspicion. We should have enough food for everyone. The kitchen door swings open, and Sergeant Brown enters with 2 other soldiers. Ladies, he says with a respectful nod, we're here to help move the food to the mess hall. His presence fills the room with a calm assurance that makes even Keiko pause in her work. I notice how Yuki's eyes follow him as he moves through the kitchen, organizing his men. There's trust there now, where fear used to be. The soldiers work alongside us with easy efficiency, treating us like equals rather than prisoners. One of them, Private Thompson, I think, even jokes about his mother's terrible cooking, making me laugh, despite myself. My mother would be horrified to see American soldiers helping in the kitchen, I say softly to Yuki. She gives me a knowing look. Many things would have horrified us before, she replies, her voice gentle. But now we know better. Keiko finishes unexpectedly. We both turn to look at her, surprised. She keeps her eyes on her work, but there's a subtle change in her expression. As we finish preparing the last of the food, I can't help but marvel at how different everything feels. The kitchen that once felt like another prison now feels almost like a sanctuary. The soldiers who were meant to be our enemies have become, well, not friends exactly, but something close to it. Later, as we sit in our barracks eating our own dinner, the change in atmosphere is palpable. The usual tension is gone. replaced by a comfortable quiet. We can hear the distant sounds of the camp settling down for the night. Footsteps on wooden planks, quiet conversations, the occasional laugh. "They're good men," Keiko says suddenly, breaking our silence. She stares down at her bowl, as if surprised by her own words. "These soldiers, they're not what we were told they would be. They show us every day that kindness exists, even in war," I add, feeling my heart swell with emotion. "Especially Sergeant Brown and his unit." Yuki nods, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "They've taught us that there's still hope," she says softly, "even after everything we've been through." I watched from the kitchen window as the new prisoners arrived. German soldiers, their uniforms dirty and worn, marched into our camp with heads held high despite being captives. My hands trembled slightly as I dried the dishes, remembering the stories we'd heard about German forces during the war. "Look at them," Yuki whispered beside me. "They seem so different from us." I nodded, understanding what she meant. While we had entered the camp broken and fearful, these men carried themselves with an unsettling pride. Their arrival brought a heaviness to the air that I hadn't felt since our first days here. The German soldiers' eyes swept across the camp, and when they landed on us working in the kitchen, their faces twisted with disgust. One of them spat on the ground and muttered something to his fellow prisoner. Though I couldn't understand his words, the hatred in his voice made me step back from the window. "Don't let them frighten you," Sergeant Brown's steady voice came from behind us. I hadn't heard him enter the kitchen. "You're safe here." His presence calmed my racing heart, but I could still feel the tension crackling through the camp like lightning before a storm. The German prisoners continued making comments as they passed by, their voices harsh and mocking. One pointed at us and laughed, making crude gestures. Keiko, who had been quietly washing dishes, suddenly dropped a plate into the sink with a clatter. "We should stay inside," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Those men, they look at us like we're nothing." I watched as Sergeant Brown squared his shoulders and stepped outside. He approached the German soldiers with measured steps, his face composed but stern. Though they towered over him, he stood his ground. The Germans sneered at him, and I caught fragments of their words, something about his skin color, cruel things that made my stomach turn. But Sergeant Brown didn't flinch. He spoke to them in a low, firm voice, his hands steady at his sides. Though I couldn't hear everything he said, his message was clear in his stance and expression. We were under his protection, and he wouldn't tolerate their behavior. Other black soldiers moved closer, backing up their sergeant. The Germans' expressions darkened, but they fell silent under Sergeant Brown's unwavering gaze. Finally, they moved away, escorted by guards to their designated area. "See?" Sergeant Brown said when he returned to the kitchen. "Nothing to worry about. They're just trying to hold on to their pride. It's all they have left." Yuki looked at him with newfound respect. "You didn't seem afraid at all." "I've faced worse than their words," he replied quietly. "And I meant what I said. You're safe here. All of you." I watched through the window as he left to oversee the new prisoners' settlement into the camp. The way he handled the situation, with dignity and strength rather than force or anger, reminded me that there was still goodness in the world, even after everything we'd been through. "Maybe Sergeant Brown is right," I said softly to Yuki and Keiko. "We are safe here." Keiko nodded slowly, her earlier fear giving way to something like admiration, as we watched Sergeant Brown speaking calmly but firmly to one of the German prisoners, defusing another potential confrontation before it could begin. I watch anxiously as more of our fellow prisoners succumb to the fever. The medical ward, once quiet and orderly, now echoes with coughs and labored breathing. My hands tremble slightly as I wring out another cool cloth, but I force myself to stay focused. Sergeant Brown stands nearby, his presence reassuring as always, directing his men with calm efficiency. "Emiko-san," he calls softly. "Could you help Private Johnson with the new patients?" I nod quickly and hurry over. Through the windows, morning light streams in, catching dust motes in its golden beams. The scene before me is both heartbreaking and inspiring. American soldiers working alongside us, Japanese women, all differences forgotten in the face of this crisis. Yuki moves between the beds with quiet determination. She's changed so much since we arrived here. Gone is the wary, broken woman who could barely meet anyone's eyes. Now she works confidently, speaking softly to patients and coordinating with the medical staff. I feel a surge of pride watching her. Water. A weak voice calls out in Japanese. I hurry to help an elderly man sit up, holding the cup steady as he sips. His grateful smile reminds me of my grandfather, and my throat tightens. Throughout the day, Sergeant Brown checks on everyone regularly. He has dark circles under his eyes. I wonder when he last slept. Yet he still finds time to offer encouragement. A gentle pat on the shoulder, a kind word. I've noticed how he pays special attention to Yuki, their interactions carrying a weight of shared understanding I don't fully grasp. As afternoon fades into evening, I pause to catch my breath. The ward is quieter now, most patients resting more comfortably thanks to the medicine the doctors administered. Through the window, I can see Yuki sitting alone on a bench in the yard, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Sergeant Brown approaches her, carrying 2 cups of tea. Even from here, I can see how she straightens slightly at his presence, accepting the cup with a small bow. They talk quietly, and I notice how Yuki's hands have stopped, shaking. Whatever he's saying seems to give her strength. I remember how she was when we first arrived. So wounded, so afraid. Now she moves through the camp with purpose, helping others despite her own pain. The soldiers respect her, especially Sergeant Brown. Their friendship seems to heal something in both of them. As I watch them, I realize that Yuki isn't just surviving anymore. She's starting to live again. She pauses longer to watch the sunset, sometimes even hums softly while working in the kitchen. Small things, perhaps, but to those of us who knew her before, they feel like miracles. The sound of approaching footsteps pulls me from my thoughts. Private Johnson needs help changing bandages. I take one last look at Yuki, still deep in conversation with Sergeant Brown, before returning to my duties. The night ahead will be long, but somehow, seeing Yuki's transformation gives me hope that we'll all make it through this crisis together. I watched from my spot near the sink as Yuki methodically wiped down the counters after another long day in the camp kitchen. The medical crisis had finally started to ease, but its effects lingered in the tired faces of everyone around us. The setting sun cast long shadows through the small windows, painting everything in soft orange light. Yuki looked different now, not just tired, but changed somehow. Gone was the fearful, withdrawn woman who had arrived with us at Camp McCoy. In her place was someone who moved with purpose, who seemed more at peace despite everything we'd been through. I pretended to focus on drying dishes, while secretly observing her interaction with Sergeant Brown as he entered the kitchen. He carried himself with that quiet dignity I'd come to recognize, and though I couldn't hear their entire conversation from where I stood, their body language spoke volumes. "The fever cases are down," I heard Yuki say softly. I never expected to feel relieved about helping American soldiers. Sergeant Brown leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed. "War makes enemies of people who might have been friends in another life," he replied. "But it doesn't have to keep us enemies." I watched Yuki's hands still on the cloth she was holding. "When we first arrived, I was so afraid," she admitted. "After everything that happened to us, I thought all soldiers were the same." "I understand fear," Sergeant Brown said. "Back home, my uniform doesn't protect me from hatred. Some folks see my skin and decide I'm their enemy without knowing me." Their words drifted over to where I stood, and I felt my own throat tighten. We'd all carried such heavy burdens of fear and distrust when we arrived. I remembered how Yuki would flinch at sudden movements, how Keiko's eyes always darted to the exits, how I'd wake up in cold sweats expecting the worst. "How do you stay kind?" Yuki asked him. "After everything you've seen and experienced?" Sergeant Brown was quiet for a moment. "Because hatred is too heavy, a burden to carry," he finally said. "My mama always told me that bitterness only poisons the vessel that holds it." I saw Yuki nod slowly, understanding filling her face. "When you brought me soup during my fever, that was the first time I realized maybe everything I believed about Americans was wrong. And working alongside you all has taught my men that the propaganda about Japanese people was wrong too," he replied. "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can bridge the widest gaps." The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft clink of dishes and the distant sounds of the camp. I watched as Yuki resumed her cleaning, but her movements were different now, more peaceful, less automatic. Sergeant Brown stayed for a few more minutes, their conversation turning to lighter topics: the weather, the improving health of the camp, tomorrow's menu. When he finally left, I saw something in Yuki's expression I hadn't seen since before the war: hope. She caught me watching and gave me a small smile. one that reached her eyes. In that moment, I understood that while the medical crisis had tested us all, it had also helped heal wounds far deeper than any fever. From where I stand near the kitchen window, I watch Keiko's transformation unfold, like a delicate flower opening its petals to the morning sun. For weeks, I've seen the conflict in her eyes whenever the American soldiers passed by, particularly Sergeant Brown. But today, something changes. It happens during the afternoon meal preparation. Through the steam rising from the soup pots, I notice Keiko pause her vegetable chopping to observe Sergeant Brown in the courtyard. One of the older Japanese prisoners, a man who often spits bitter words at our captors, has fallen to his knees, overcome with grief about news from home. Instead of walking past or responding with anger, Sergeant Brown kneels beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. My heart swells as I watch Keiko's expression soften. Her usual mask of suspicion cracks, revealing something vulnerable underneath. When Yuki enters the kitchen a few moments later, Keiko suddenly puts down her knife and wipes her hands on her apron. "Yuki," she calls out, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to tell you something." I pretend to focus on stirring the soup, but I can't help listening as Keiko speaks words I never thought I'd hear from her. "I was wrong," she says quietly to Yuki. "About the American soldiers. About Sergeant Brown." Her hands grip the edge of the counter, knuckles white. All this time, I've been so afraid to trust, to believe that anyone could show us kindness without wanting something in return. Yuki remains silent, giving Keiko space to continue. I add more vegetables to the soup, moving as quietly as possible. But watching him out there just now, Keiko's voice catches. That man has said such horrible things to him, called him terrible names, yet Sergeant Brown still treats him with dignity. It's not pity in his eyes, it's understanding. I risk a glance at them. Tears shine in Keiko's eyes, something I haven't seen since our first days in captivity. I've been so stubborn, so scared to open my heart, but these men, they're not our enemies. They never were. They're just people, Yuki says softly, trying to do what's right in a world that often isn't. Keiko nods, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. I see that now. I see how wrong I was to hold on to so much hatred and fear. She turns to face Yuki fully. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for showing me that it's possible to trust again." The two women stand in silence for a moment, the afternoon sun streaming through the kitchen window, casting warm squares of light on the floor between them. Then, in a gesture that brings tears to my own eyes, Keiko reaches out and takes Yuki's hand. They share a look of deep understanding, two souls who have traversed the darkest valleys of human experience and found their way to a filed place of healing. I feel privileged to witness this moment, this small miracle of the heart opening despite all the reasons it has to stay closed. Through my own tears, I watch them embrace, and I know that something profound has shifted in our little community. Keiko's walls have finally crumbled, and in their place, something new and hopeful has begun to grow. I watched the camp burst into life as news of Germany's surrender spread like wildfire through Camp McCoy. The May sunshine felt warmer somehow, matching the rising spirits of everyone around us. Even Keiko, who had been so guarded for so long, couldn't hide a small smile. From my spot near the kitchen window, I saw American soldiers embracing each other, their faces lit with joy. Some were crying, others laughing, and a few just stood in silence, perhaps thinking of home. Sergeant Brown walked among them, shaking hands and patting shoulders, his usual calm demeanor touched by the excitement of the moment. "Can you believe it, Yuki?" I asked, turning to my friend who stood beside me peeling potatoes. "The war in Europe is over." Yuki nodded slowly, her hands steady as she worked. "But Japan still fights," she said softly. The weight of her words settled over us like a heavy blanket. I understood what she meant. While the German prison of wars would soon be heading home, our future remained uncertain. Japan was our home, but the thought of returning filled me with mixed emotions. What would we find there? How many more lives would be lost before peace finally came? Through the window, I could see some of the German prisoners being told the news. Their reactions varied. Some looked relieved, others appeared defeated. The Black American soldiers treated them with the same respect they'd shown us, even in this moment of victory. It was something I still found remarkable. "Look," I said, gesturing toward Sergeant Brown as he approached our kitchen. "Even today, he checks on us." The door creaked open, and Sergeant Brown entered with his characteristic gentle presence. Ladies, he said, nodding to each of us. I wanted to make sure you heard the news. We did, I replied, bowing slightly. Congratulations on your victory. He smiled, but there was something solemn in his eyes. Thank you, Emiko. But we all know there's still work to be done in the Pacific. Keiko, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Will you go there next? To fight against Japan? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. We'd all grown to respect this man who had shown us such kindness, and the thought of him fighting our countrymen was difficult to bear. Those orders haven't come yet, he answered carefully. For now, my duty is here, making sure you ladies are safe and cared for. I noticed how he avoided a direct answer, probably trying to spare our feelings. That was typical of him, always thinking of others' comfort, even in small ways. The sounds of celebration continued outside, a stark contrast to the quiet tension in our kitchen. A group of soldiers had started singing somewhere in the distance, their voices carrying across the camp. Whatever comes next, Sergeant Brown said. I hope you know that not all Americans wish harm to the Japanese people. We want peace, just like you do. His words touched something deep inside me. Despite everything, the war, the propaganda we'd been raised with, the horrors we'd endured, here was proof that humanity could transcend national boundaries. The victory in Europe wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about the possibility of a world without war. As we stood there, the four of us in that simple camp kitchen, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The war wasn't over yet, but peace no longer seemed like an impossible dream. I watched from behind as Yuki walked toward Sergeant Brown that morning. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across Camp McCoy's grounds. The war in Europe was over, and we all knew our time here was growing short. The thought filled me with a strange mix of joy and sadness. My heart ached as I observed their conversation from the barracks doorway. Even from this distance, I could see the emotion in both their faces. Sergeant Brown stood tall and dignified as always, his hands clasped behind his back, but there was a gentleness in his expression I'd come to recognize over these months. You should go closer, Keiko whispered beside me. You might want to hear this. I nodded and moved closer, pretending to sweep the ground near them. The morning breeze carried their words to me. The arrangements have been made, Sergeant Brown was saying. You'll be leaving tomorrow morning. There's a train that will take you to San Francisco, and from there, a ship to Japan. Yuki finished quietly. Her voice trembled slightly. I paused in my sweeping, watching as Sergeant Brown's expression softened even more. You've come so far, Yuki. All of you have. When I think back to those first days, we were so afraid, Yuki admitted. We expected the worst. Instead, we found... She struggled to find the words. Humanity, Sergeant Brown supplied. The same humanity that exists in all of us, no matter which side of this war we were on. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. How true those words were. When we'd arrived, we'd been broken, expecting nothing but continued cruelty. Instead, we'd found kindness in the most unexpected place, from men who had every reason to hate us. You taught us how to forgive, Yuki said softly. Not just others, but ourselves too. She looked down at her hands. I didn't think that was possible anymore. Sergeant Brown nodded slowly. The road ahead won't be easy. Japan has changed. You've changed too. Yes, Yuki agreed. But maybe that's good. Maybe that's what we needed. To learn that kindness can exist even in the darkest places. I watched as Sergeant Brown straightened his uniform, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the emotion in his eyes. You're stronger than you know, Yuki. All of you are. Remember that. We will never forget what you've done for us, Yuki said, her voice thick with emotion. How you showed us that enemies can become. She paused, searching for the right word. Friends, Sergeant Brown finished simply. I turned away then, my vision blurred with tears. The next morning came too quickly. We gathered our few belongings and boarded the waiting train. As we pulled away from Camp McCoy, I watched Yuki press her hand against the window, her eyes fixed on the figure of Sergeant Brown growing smaller in the distance. The wheels clattered against the tracks, taking us toward San Francisco, toward the ship that would carry us back to Japan. But the lessons we learned here, about forgiveness, about humanity, about hope, those would stay with us forever. Look, Keiko said softly, pointing out the window. In the distance, Camp McCoy was disappearing into the morning mist. We were leaving behind more than just a prison camp. We were leaving behind the place where we had learned to trust again, to hope again, to live again. I stood next to Yuki as our ship docked in Yokohama Harbor. The familiar sight of Japan's shores brought tears to my eyes, though they weren't entirely tears of joy. So much had changed since we'd left, not just in our country, but in our hearts. The city looked different from what I remembered. Buildings stood broken and burned, their skeletal frames reaching toward the gray sky. American soldiers patrolled the streets, but seeing them no longer filled me with dread. Instead, I thought of Sergeant Brown and the other men at Camp McCoy, who had shown us such kindness. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" I whispered to Yuki as we walked down the gangplank. She nodded, clutching her small bag of belongings. Behind us, Keiko moved silently, her face a mask of emotions I couldn't quite read. The dock was crowded with returning Japanese, soldiers, civilians, and others like us who had been held in camps abroad. Many looked shell-shocked, their eyes vacant and distant. But we were different. Our time at Camp McCoy had changed us in ways I was only beginning to understand. "I keep hearing his voice," Yuki said softly as we made our way through the crowd. I knew she meant Sergeant Brown. He told me that survival wasn't enough, that we needed to learn to live again. I reached for her hand and squeezed it. He was right. We're not just survivors anymore. The streets of Yokohama were eerily quiet compared to my memories. People hurried past with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Somewhere in the distance, a child cried. The sound echoed off the damaged buildings, a reminder of all that had been lost. But as we walked, I noticed small signs of life returning. A woman sold sweet potatoes from a cart. Children played in the rubble, their laughter a stark contrast to the destruction around them. An old man carefully swept the entrance to his partially standing shop. "Look," I said to Yuki, pointing to a cluster of morning glories growing up a broken wall. "Life continues." She smiled, and I saw in her eyes the same strength I'd watched grow during our time at Camp McCoy. The fear and shame that had once defined us had transformed into something else. Not gone completely, but changed, like coal pressed into diamond by time and pressure. As we reached the checkpoint where we would part ways, Yuki turned to me. "I never thought I'd feel hope again," she said, "after everything. But Sergeant Brown and the others showed us that kindness exists even in the darkest places. They taught us that we are more than what happened to us," I replied, thinking of all the small acts of compassion we'd witnessed at the camp. Keiko, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "They showed us that enemies can become friends, that hatred isn't the only way." We stood there for a moment, three women forever bonded by our shared experience. The war had taken so much from us, but in an American prison of war camp, we had found something precious, our humanity. Yuki adjusted her bag on her shoulder, ready to take her first steps into this new chapter of her life. The smile that crossed her face was gentle but real, full of the grace we had learned from those who had once been our enemies. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.